My stepfather convinced my dying mother to leave everything to his kids instead of me, then kicked me out the day after her funeral. 5 years later, I discovered he forged her will. I was 19 when my mother called me home from college. The cancer had spread faster than anyone expected. "Promise me," she whispered, gripping my hand with what little strength she had left, "that you'll be okay, that you'll take care of yourself." I thought she meant emotionally. I had no idea she was talking about money. Mom had married Richard when I was 12. He seemed perfect, charming, successful, devoted to her. He owned a small accounting firm called Coleman and Associates and drove a BMW that he kept spotless. He moved into our house on Maple Street, helped with my homework every night at the kitchen table, and called me his daughter. When other kids complained about step-parents, I felt lucky. Richard never tried to replace my dad, who died when I was 8. Instead, he carved out his own space in our lives. "You know I love you like my own, right?" he'd say when tucking me in. "Your mom and I were building something beautiful here." The first red flag should have been how quickly he inserted himself into Mom's financial life. Within 6 months of marriage, he'd convinced her to add his name to her bank accounts. "It's practical," he explained during one of their kitchen table conversations I overheard. "If something happens to you, I can take care of Natasha without legal complications." Mom had been independent her whole life. She'd worked 2 jobs after Dad died, teaching elementary school during the day and doing bookkeeping for local businesses at night. She saved every penny, clipped coupons religiously, and bought our house through sheer determination and a first-time buyers program. But Richard had a way of making dependence sound like love. "Let me handle the boring stuff," he'd say, taking over bill payments and investments. "You focus on being happy." I remember the exact moment Mom started deferring to him completely. We were at the bank, and she was about to sign papers for a CD renewal. Richard gently took the pen from her hand. "Honey, let me review the terms first," he said with that charming smile. "The interest rates might not be competitive." Mom laughed. "Listen to me, trying to handle finances when I have my own personal expert right here." The bank teller smiled. "How sweet. You're so lucky to have someone who takes care of these details." From that day forward, Richard handled everything financial. Insurance policies, investment decisions, even Mom's paycheck direct deposits. She'd joke about being financially challenged and praise Richard's expertise to anyone who'd listen. When Mom got sick 3 years later, Richard became her primary caregiver. He handled everything from insurance claims to medication schedules, driving her to every appointment in his pristine BMW. He'd sit in waiting rooms with a yellow legal pad, taking meticulous notes about treatments and side effects. "You're so lucky to have him," the nurses would say. Not every man would be this dedicated. I believed them completely. Richard seemed tireless in his devotion. He researched experimental treatments, printing out studies from medical journals and highlighting relevant passages. He consulted with specialists across the country, sometimes driving 6 hours for second opinions. He never missed a single chemotherapy session, sitting beside Mom for hours as poison dripped into her veins. When Mom was too weak to eat, he'd spend hours making different smoothie combinations until he found something she could keep down. Mango ginger, strawberry banana with protein powder, chocolate peanut butter with nutritional supplements. He'd chart her caloric intake like a scientist documenting an experiment. "I don't know what I'd do without him," Mom told me during one of my weekend visits home. She was skeletal by then, her beautiful auburn hair replaced by a colorful scarf Richard had special ordered from a boutique in Seattle. "He's handling everything so I can focus on getting better." But she wasn't getting better. The cancer was aggressive, resistant to treatment. By spring of my sophomore year, the doctors had exhausted their options. The oncologist, Dr. Williams, sat us down in his office with its fake plants and inspirational posters. "We're looking at weeks, not months," he said gently. "It's time to focus on comfort and quality of life." Richard's response was immediate and controlling. "Natasha doesn't need to hear the medical details," he told Dr. Williams. "She's got finals coming up. I'll handle the care decisions." During her final weeks, I took a leave of absence to be home. That's when I noticed Richard's behavior becoming protective to the point of paranoid. Whenever lawyers visited, he would gently but firmly escort me out. "She needs rest," he'd explain, his hand firm on my shoulder. "We're just handling boring paperwork, insurance stuff, medical directives, power of attorney updates, nothing you need to worry about." I trusted him completely. He was handling the stress so I could focus on saying goodbye. The conversations I wasn't allowed to hear went like this. I learned later from depositions. "Mrs. Coleman, given your condition, we need to finalize your estate planning," Attorney Davidson would say. "I've already made my wishes clear," Mom would reply weakly. "Everything goes to Natasha. She's my only child, my whole world." "Of course," Richard would interject smoothly. "But Patricia, we should consider tax implications. Natasha's young, she might make poor decisions with a large inheritance. What if we set up a trust with my boys as secondary beneficiaries, just as a safeguard?" Richard was masterful at planting seeds of doubt. He'd mentioned stories about young people squandering inheritances, celebrities who'd blown through millions, lottery winners who'd ended up bankrupt, trust fund kids who'd become drug addicts. "I just want what's best for Natasha," he'd say. Maybe some guidance would help her. Maybe the boys could serve as trustees until she's older, more mature. Mom was too sick to fight, too trusting to question the man who'd been handling her affairs for years. The morphine made her foggy, and Richard was always there with a reasonable-sounding explanation for every decision. "You're right," she'd eventually concede. You know about these things. I trust your judgment. But according to Attorney Davidson's notes, Mom never actually signed anything. Every meeting ended with her saying she needed to think about it, needed to discuss it with me first. Let me talk to Natasha, she'd say. This affects her future. Of course, Richard would reply. But maybe wait until she's done with finals. No need to stress her during exam period. Mom died on a Tuesday in May, 3 days before I was supposed to take my organic chemistry final. I was holding her hand when she took her last breath, Richard on her other side stroking her forehead. I love you so much, baby, she whispered to me. Take care of yourself. Be strong. Her last words to Richard were, take care of my girl. The funeral was beautiful. St. Mary's Catholic Church was packed with Mom's co-workers from Jefferson Elementary, neighbors from our street, and friends from her book club. The choir sang Amazing Grace, Mom's favorite hymn. Richard spoke about their love story, how Mom had made him a better man, how she'd brought light into his world after his bitter divorce. Patricia was more than my wife, he said, his voice breaking convincingly. She was my partner, my best friend, and the mother who helped me raise my daughter Natasha into the remarkable young woman she is today. He talked about Mom's strength during her illness, her grace under pressure, her concern for others even while fighting her own battle. Several people came up to me afterward, praising Richard's devotion and expressing gratitude that I had such a caring stepfather to help me through this difficult time. I felt grateful to have him. At least I wouldn't be completely alone. That night, after the last casserole dish had been returned and the final guest had left, Richard poured himself a scotch and sat in Dad's old recliner. I noticed he'd been making himself at home in ways that felt permanent. His morning coffee routine had replaced Mom's. His newspapers were spread across the kitchen table where she used to grade papers. His clothes were hanging in her closet beside her dresses. We'll get through this together, he said, raising his glass. Your mother would want us to take care of each other. I went to bed feeling like I still had family. The next morning, everything changed. I was packing to return to school when Richard appeared in my doorway with 2 large boxes and a roll of packing tape. Gone was yesterday's grieving stepfather. This man looked like a stranger, cold, businesslike, impatient. Even his posture was different, straighter and more aggressive. I need you out by noon, he said, checking his expensive Rolex. What do you mean? I asked, confused. Out where? Out of this house. It belongs to me now. Everything does. Your mother left it all to Bryce and Camden, his sons from his first marriage, boys I'd met maybe 5 times during awkward holiday visits where they'd barely acknowledged my existence beyond mumbled hellos. That's impossible. Mom would never. Check the will yourself. He tossed a document at me like it was junk mail. Dated 3 weeks ago. Witnessed and notarized. Completely legal. My hands shook as I read the document. The language was formal, sterile, nothing like Mom's usual warm communication style. I, Patricia Ann Coleman, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and declare this to be my last will and testament. To my beloved stepsons, Bryce Richard Montgomery and Camden James Montgomery, who have brought such joy to my husband's life and shown me the meaning of family, I leave my entire estate including but not limited to the property at 1247 Maple Street, all bank accounts, investment portfolios, personal effects, jewelry, and any other assets in my name. These young men represent the future, and I trust they will use these resources wisely to build meaningful lives. To my daughter Natasha Elizabeth Coleman, I leave my love and best wishes for her future, confident that her education and youth will serve her well in creating her own success. The house worth $400,000, her savings account with $180,000, her investment portfolio that she'd been building since Dad died, even her jewelry, everything went to Richard's children, boys who lived 3 states away with their mother. Boys who'd never called Mom on her birthday, never sent a Mother's Day card, never showed any interest in her life beyond polite small talk during their rare visits. She was on heavy medication, I protested, my voice getting higher and more desperate. She wasn't thinking clearly. The doctor said the pain pills could cause confusion, hallucinations. The lawyers verified her mental capacity. Richard cut me off. She made her choice. Money goes to people who'll use it responsibly. College kids just waste it on parties and spring break trips. I'm her daughter. I'm her only child. Richard's expression didn't change. His eyes were cold, calculating. And you'll be fine. You're young, educated, motivated. You'll figure it out like everyone else your age. He checked his watch again. 11:30. Time's running out. Where am I supposed to go? Panic was setting in. My dorm room wasn't available until the following week for summer session students. I don't have money for a hotel. My financial aid doesn't cover housing during break. That's not my problem anymore. He started placing my belongings in the boxes with efficient, practiced movements. There's a youth hostel downtown, $40 a night, or maybe one of your college friends can help. I wanted to scream, to fight, to demand explanations. But what could I do? The will looked official. Heavy cream-colored paper, raised embossed seal, multiple signatures in blue ink. I was a 19-year-old girl with $847 in my checking account and no understanding of legal processes. Can I at least take some of Mom's things? Her photo albums? Her jewelry? The will is very clear. Personal effects go to Bryce and Camden. You can take what's yours. Clothes, school supplies, items you brought into this house. I stared at him in disbelief. Her wedding ring from my father? The photo albums with my baby pictures? The necklace she wore every day? Not yours, Richard said firmly. Never was. But the photo albums have pictures of me growing up. My first steps, first day of school, my graduation. The albums themselves belong to the estate. You can make copies if you want. I spent the next hour in a daze, loading my car with whatever fit. My clothes from high school and college, textbooks, laptop, a few photos from my own room that I'd taken myself. Richard supervised the entire process, checking through boxes to make sure I wasn't taking anything that belonged to Mom. When I tried to take a small jewelry box that contained my grandmother's pearls, technically Mom's mother's pearls that had been promised to me, Richard intercepted. Estate property, he said, plucking the box from my hands. Those were my grandmother's. Mom always said they'd be mine someday. Maybe they will be, when Bryce and Camden decide what to do with the jewelry collection. His smile was cruel. They're reasonable boys. They might let you buy them back. I ended up at my friend Jessica's apartment, sleeping on her couch and crying for 3 days straight. Jessica's parents, the Hendersons, offered to let me stay until school started, but their small 2-bedroom apartment was already cramped with 4 people. I can't believe he just kicked you out, Jessica said, bringing me another cup of chamomile tea in a chipped mug. After everything you've been through, there has to be something you can do. But I'd already called 3 lawyers from the Yellow Pages. Consultations cost $200 to $300 just to walk in the door. Money I didn't have. The Legal Aid Society had a 6-month waiting list, and they all said the same thing. If the will was properly executed, there wasn't much hope of contesting it successfully, without evidence of fraud or coercion. Grief makes people do strange things, one attorney told me over the phone. Sometimes parents make decisions that seem illogical to their children. Without proof that your mother was mentally incompetent or being threatened, the courts generally respect a person's final wishes. The next 5 years were brutal in ways I couldn't have imagined. I returned to college but lost my work-study job because I'd missed too much time during Mom's illness. Financial aid helped with tuition, but I still needed to work constantly to survive. I waitressed at Denny's on weeknights, earning $4.50 an hour, plus tips that barely covered gas money to get to campus. The dinner shift meant dealing with drunk college students who'd leave messes and pocket change, families with screaming children who'd demand endless refills and modifications, and lonely elderly people who'd stay for hours nursing a single cup of coffee. Weekends, I tutored rich kids whose parents paid me $20 an hour to help them pass classes I was acing despite working myself to exhaustion. I'd sit in their pristine bedrooms surrounded by expensive furniture and clothes, explaining basic chemistry concepts to teenagers who spent more on their monthly allowance than I made in a semester. I cleaned offices before dawn, mopping floors and emptying trash cans in buildings where people made more in a day than I made in a month. I'd arrive at 4 a.m., vacuum conference rooms where executives had made million-dollar deals, and wipe down bathrooms used by people who'd never had to worry about money. I sold my textbooks back early, borrowed notes from classmates, and photocopied entire chapters at the library, instead of buying required books. I ate ramen noodles so often that the smell still makes me nauseous. I learned to make a single bag of pasta last 3 days, mixing it with whatever free condiments I could collect from restaurants. I slept on friends' couches, in my car when necessary, and once spent a week in the campus library because I had nowhere else to go. The security guards knew me by name and pretended not to notice when I'd curl up behind the stacks with my backpack as a pillow. I applied for every scholarship, every grant, every program that might help. I wrote essays about overcoming adversity and pursuing education, despite financial hardship. I filled out FAFSA forms claiming my mother was dead and my stepfather wasn't supporting me, which was technically true. The government agreed. I qualified for maximum assistance. But I never stopped thinking about that will. Something felt fundamentally wrong. Mom had always been meticulous about legal documents, keeping copies of everything in her fire-safe box, reading every line of every contract twice before signing. She'd made me read my college applications out loud so we could catch any errors. She'd spent hours researching every major financial decision, from choosing car insurance to selecting her retirement plan. But this will was strangely simple for someone who'd planned every detail of her life down to her funeral playlist. The language was formal and cold, nothing like Mom's usual warm communication style. She never called Richard's sons beloved stepsons. She barely knew them well enough to remember their middle names. And why would she leave everything to boys she barely knew? Boys who never called, never visited, never showed any interest in her life beyond Christmas thank you notes their mother probably forced them to write? I remembered her stories about growing up poor in rural Kentucky, how she'd saved every penny from her first job at 15 to help her family pay rent, how her own mother had died without a will, leaving the family to fight over a mobile home and a rusted pickup truck, how she'd sworn she'd never put her children through that kind of uncertainty. "This will be yours someday," she'd say when we painted my bedroom lavender in 8th grade. "Your security, your foundation. I want you to have what I never had. Choices." The woman who'd fought the insurance company for 3 months to cover my orthodontics, who'd driven to 5 different stores to find the cheapest school supplies, who'd saved for 2 years to buy me a laptop for college, that woman wouldn't just abandon me. During my final semester, I took a class on estate law as an elective. Professor Martinez was a former probate attorney who'd transitioned to teaching after 20 years in practice. He peppered his lectures with real-world examples of family disputes and inheritance fraud. "Undue influence is more common than people think," he explained during one memorable lecture. especially when dealing with elderly or sick individuals who become dependent on caregivers. The law recognizes that vulnerability can be exploited, but proving it requires evidence. I learned that medication doesn't automatically invalidate someone's mental capacity. There had to be proof of confusion or coercion. I discovered that wills could be contested years after probate if new evidence emerged, though the statute of limitations varied by state. Most importantly, I learned that handwriting analysis could determine if signatures were forged. Document fraud is surprisingly common in inheritance cases, Professor Martinez explained. Beneficiaries forge signatures, alter existing documents, or create entirely fake wills. But modern forensic techniques can detect these forgeries with remarkable accuracy. I started taking detailed notes, asking questions that probably seemed academic to my classmates but felt deeply personal to me. I learned about discovery processes, expert witnesses, and the burden of proof required to overturn a will. After graduation, I moved across the country to Portland for a job at a nonprofit called Family Justice Advocates. We helped families navigate probate court, contest fraudulent wills, and recover stolen inheritances. The pay was terrible, $28,000 a year, but I was learning invaluable skills while helping people in situations similar to mine. I told myself I was helping others, but really, I was learning how to help myself. My boss, Margaret Santos, was a former prosecutor who'd started the organization after her own mother was victimized by a caregiver who'd manipulated her into changing her will. Margaret was a fierce advocate with silver hair and piercing blue eyes who could intimidate opposing attorneys twice her size. The elderly and sick are prime targets, Margaret explained during my training. Predators isolate them from family, make themselves indispensable, then strike when their victims are most vulnerable. They're patient, methodical, and often very charming. I worked case after case that reminded me of my own situation. Adult children cut out of wills they'd never seen. Caregivers who'd convinced lonely seniors to leave them everything. Family members who'd forged signatures or coerced changes during medical crises. One case involved a woman whose stepson had convinced her dying husband to leave him the family farm instead of her children. Another featured a home health aide who'd manipulated an elderly man into naming her as his sole beneficiary. Each case taught me something new about how inheritance fraud worked. The key is documentation, Margaret taught me. Compare signatures, find witnesses, follow the money trail. Fraudsters always leave evidence if you know where to look. They think they're smarter than everyone else, but greed makes them sloppy. I saved every penny for 3 years, living in a studio apartment with no air conditioning and a refrigerator that only worked intermittently. The apartment was in a questionable neighborhood where sirens wailed nightly and my car got broken into twice. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch and dinner, rode my bike to work in all weather, and bought clothes exclusively at Goodwill. I cut my own hair using YouTube tutorials and kitchen scissors. I canceled my cell phone plan and used the office phone for emergencies. I learned to darn socks and patch holes in jeans rather than buying new clothes. Finally, last month, I had enough saved to hire Dennis Kovac, a private investigator Margaret recommended who specialized in financial fraud. Dennis was a former Portland police detective who'd worked white-collar crime for 15 years before starting his own firm. Your stepfather's an accountant, right? Dennis asked during our first meeting at a coffee shop near his office. He was a big man with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much human cruelty. That makes this easier. Financial guys always think they're smarter than everyone else, but they leave digital footprints everywhere. Dennis charged $75 an hour plus expenses. A fortune for me, but reasonable compared to attorneys who wanted $400 hourly. I gave him everything I had. Copies of the will, Mom's medical records, bank statements I'd managed to obtain, and contact information for everyone who'd known Mom during her final months. What Dennis found changed everything. The handwriting analysis came back, Dennis said 2 weeks later, sliding a thick folder across the table at our usual coffee shop. His expression was grim but satisfied. The signature on that will? It's not your mother's. My heart stopped. What do you mean? I compared it to her signature on medical forms from the same time period. Hospital admission papers, insurance claims, pharmacy receipts, all signed during her final month. The pen pressure is different, the letter formation is off, the rhythm is wrong. Someone else signed her name. He pulled out enlarged photocopies showing the differences in microscopic detail. Mom's real signature had a distinctive loop in the P of Patricia and a sharp angle in the C of Coleman that she'd developed over decades of signing report cards and permission slips. The will signature was close but clearly different, the work of someone who'd practiced but couldn't perfectly replicate her natural hand movements. I also found the original will, Dennis continued, the real one, filed with her attorney Mitchell and Associates 2 years before she got sick. Want to guess who inherits everything? My hands trembled as I opened the folder. There it was, in Mom's careful handwriting on official letterhead with the firm's watermark. I, Patricia Ann Coleman, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. I leave my entire estate, including my home at 1247 Maple Street, all financial accounts, investments, and personal property, to my beloved daughter Natasha Coleman, knowing she will honor my memory and use these resources wisely to build a meaningful life. Richard forged it, I whispered, the words feeling surreal even as I spoke them. Gets better. Dennis continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a detective who'd cracked a difficult case. Those witnesses on the fake will? Margaret Henderson and Robert Cruz? I tracked them both down. Margaret moved to Pensacola, Florida, 6 months before the supposed signing date. Robert was in court-ordered rehab at Riverside Recovery Center during that entire week. Neither of them witnessed anything. The notary stamp was fake, too. Dennis had tracked down the real notary, a woman named Linda Walsh, who worked at First National Bank across town. I showed her the will, Dennis explained. She's never seen it before, never met your mother, never been to your house on Maple Street. Her notary seal was either stolen or counterfeited. She's filing a police report for identity theft. Dennis had gone even deeper, investigating Richard's background and methods. Your stepfather's accounting background gave him access to legal forms and notary stamps. Probably practiced your mother's signature for weeks using old documents, insurance papers, bank forms, anything with her signature. The level of premeditation was staggering. Richard had been planning this theft for months, maybe years. He's thorough, I'll give him that, Dennis said. But he made mistakes. The paper stock is wrong for that law firm. The formatting doesn't match their standard templates. And he got greedy with the language, calling his boys beloved stepsons when your mother barely knew them. I felt rage building in my chest like a volcano preparing to erupt. So what now? Now we call the district attorney. This isn't just a civil matter, it's criminal fraud, wire fraud, forgery, theft, elder abuse. Your stepfather's looking at serious prison time. Dennis had compiled a comprehensive case file that read like a prosecutor's dream. Bank records showing Richard had started liquidating Mom's assets within days of her death. Real estate records showing he'd sold the house 18 months later for $440,000. $40,000 more than the assessed value. Investment account statements showing he'd transferred everything to accounts in his son's names, then gradually moved the money through shell companies he'd created. He stole almost $700,000, Dennis calculated, spreading out financial documents across the coffee shop table. Plus interest and appreciation over 5 years, you're looking at over $900,000 in damages. But the most damning evidence was Richard's own accounting records. Dennis had subpoenaed his business files through a sympathetic judge, discovering that Richard had been skimming from his own clients for years. This guy's a serial fraudster, Dennis explained. He's been manipulating elderly clients, overcharging fees, and stealing from trust accounts. Your mother wasn't his first victim, just his biggest score. 2 weeks later, I was standing across the street from Coleman and Associates when the police arrived. Richard's accounting firm occupied the ground floor of a small professional building on Oak Street, the same office where he'd worked for 12 years building his reputation as a trustworthy financial advisor. I watched from my rental car as 2 detectives and an FBI agent entered the building. 20 minutes later, they led Richard out in handcuffs. He looked older than I remembered, grayer, softer around the middle, confused and frightened. His expensive suit couldn't hide the shock and fear on his face as photographers from the Oregonian captured his perp walk. Richard Montgomery, you're under arrest for wire fraud, forgery, and elder abuse, Detective Morrison announced loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. His BMW got towed from the parking lot. The Coleman and Associates sign came down that afternoon. By evening, the local news was running stories about the trusted accountant who'd defrauded his dying wife and multiple clients. His sons, Bryce and Camden, had no idea about their father's crimes. They'd been living off stolen money for 5 years. Bryce's college tuition at Oregon State, Camden's car, their apartment deposits, spring break trips to Mexico, graduate school applications. When the truth came out, they immediately hired lawyers and returned everything they could. We're so sorry, Bryce told me during our awkward meeting at the prosecutor's office. He was 24 now, working as a junior accountant at a firm in Salem. Ironically enough, we thought your mom really wanted us to have it. Dad said you two had problems, that you'd been disrespectful during her illness. He told us you dropped out of school to party, Camden added. He was 22, finishing his marketing degree at Portland State. Said your mom was worried about you wasting money on drugs and bad friends. We felt terrible for her, having to deal with cancer and a troubled daughter. Richard had poisoned his own sons against me, making them complicit in his theft, while believing they were helping a family friend's worried stepfather deal with a troubled daughter. They genuinely thought they were doing the right thing. We want to make this right, Bryce continued. We've already transferred back everything we can access. The lawyers say it might take time to unwind all the investments, but you'll get everything back. The house had been sold 2 years ago to a young family with twins named the Johnsons, but I got the proceeds plus interest. The investments had grown substantially. Mom's conservative portfolio had appreciated to nearly $340,000. Mom's jewelry was harder to track since Richard had sold most of it to fund his lifestyle, but insurance covered the losses based on appraisals she'd had done years earlier. When everything was settled, I inherited $847,000, almost exactly what Mom had intended to leave me, plus 5 years of compound interest. But the best part was testifying at Richard's trial. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, but packed with reporters, former clients, and curious locals who'd followed the story in the newspaper. Richard sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive suits replaced with county jail attire. He'd aged dramatically during the 6 months since his arrest. His hair had gone completely gray, and he'd lost significant weight. Miss Coleman, Prosecutor Janet Williams began, did the defendant ever discuss your mother's will with you? Yes, I said. looking directly at Richard for the first time in 5 years. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He told me my mother made her choice. That money goes to people who'll use it responsibly. Did he express any concern about your ability to handle an inheritance? He said college kids just waste money on parties, that I was young and would figure things out like everyone else my age. Did he ever suggest that you and your mother had relationship problems? No, but he told his sons that we did. He convinced them I was a troubled daughter who'd been disrespectful during Mom's illness. Richard's defense attorney, a tired-looking public defender named Johnson, tried to argue that his client had genuinely believed the will was real. Maybe Mom had changed her mind during her illness. Maybe she'd been influenced by medication to make poor decisions. But the handwriting evidence was damning. 3 different experts had analyzed the signatures and reached the same conclusion: forgery. The timeline didn't work either. The supposed witnesses were provably elsewhere during the signing date. Most devastating were the bank records and Richard's own business files. He'd accessed Mom's accounts the day after her death, transferring money to shell companies he'd created months earlier. He'd sold the house through a realtor who happened to be his golf buddy, splitting the commission through an arrangement that netted him an extra $15,000. This wasn't a crime of passion, Prosecutor Williams argued during closing statements. This was a calculated, premeditated theft that began before Patricia Coleman was even dead. The defendant systematically isolated the victim from her daughter, controlled her medical information, and positioned himself to steal everything she'd worked for her entire life. The prosecutor had also uncovered Richard's history of financial fraud, dating back years before he'd even met Mom. He'd been skimming from client accounts, overcharging elderly customers, and manipulating vulnerable people who trusted him with their life savings. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Richard got 8 years in state prison, 2 for the forgery, 3 for elder abuse, and 3 for wire fraud, to be served consecutively. His accounting license was permanently revoked. His firm collapsed when clients learned their trusted advisor was a convicted forger. Several former clients sued him in civil court, claiming he'd mismanaged their accounts too. The insurance company that had bonded his business paid out over $400,000 in claims to victims of his fraudulent schemes. I used the inheritance exactly how Mom would have wanted. I bought a house in Portland's Alberta neighborhood, a small craftsman bungalow with a garden where I could grow vegetables like Mom used to. I paid off my student loans and started a master's program in social work at Portland State. I expanded Family Justice Advocate's budget, hiring 2 additional investigators and a part-time attorney to help other families recover stolen inheritances. And I set aside money for future kids' college funds, determined that my children would never face the struggles I'd endured. The organization grew rapidly as word spread about our success. We helped a Vietnam veteran recover $200,000 stolen by his nephew. We exposed a ring of caregivers who'd been systematically defrauding elderly clients. We even assisted other states' attorney generals in prosecuting inheritance fraud cases. Last week, I got a letter from Richard at Oregon State Penitentiary. His handwriting was shakier now, less confident than the bold strokes he'd once used to forge my mother's signature. Natasha, I know you'll never forgive me, but I need you to understand something. I didn't do this out of greed. I did it for my boys. They deserved a chance at success. And your mother's money could provide that. You were young, intelligent, capable of building your own life. They needed the help more than you did. Everything I did was motivated by love for my children, just like your mother's love for you. I hope someday you'll understand that parents sometimes make difficult choices for their children's benefit. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just understanding. I wrote back with 1 sentence. My mother's signature says otherwise. Then I drove to Mountain View Cemetery where Mom is buried. Her headstone reads, Patricia Ann Coleman, beloved mother and fighter. I'd chosen those words carefully. Mom had fought for everything she'd achieved, and she'd raised me to be a fighter too. I placed fresh white roses by her grave, the same flowers she'd carried in her wedding bouquet when she married Dad. I told her about the trial, about Richard's conviction, about the justice she'd finally received. I kept my promise. I whispered to the granite stone. I took care of myself, and I learned to fight for what's right. As I drove away, I thought about the 19-year-old girl who'd left that house on Maple Street, with nothing but boxes of memories and a broken heart. She'd believed in justice, but didn't know how to fight for it. She'd trusted that good people would help her, and that the truth would emerge naturally. Now I know better. Now I help other people fight too. Richard stole 5 years of my life, but he gave me something else. The knowledge that the truth always surfaces eventually. You just have to be patient enough to dig for it, brave enough to challenge powerful people, and smart enough to document everything. Every week, families call our nonprofit with stories just like mine. Adult children cut out of wills by manipulative caregivers, elderly parents convinced to sign documents they don't understand, vulnerable people victimized by those they trusted most. We help them fight back. We help them win, because sometimes the best revenge is making sure it never happens to anyone else.